Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with How I Discovered Tchaikovsky. Now, it's difficult for younger people today, I think, to understand just how much part of our musical DNA Tchaikovsky was when I was growing up in the 1960s. And of course, it was even more so in the decades before that. Tchaikovsky was the quintessential classical crossover composer. His tunes were so ubiquitous as pop songs. There was Tonight We Love, which was the opening of the Piano Concerto No. 1. There is This Is the Story of a Starry Night, whatever that was called, from the Pathetique Symphony. There was None But the Lonely Heart, whatever that was. I didn't even knew. But there were these gorgeous tunes. And you just sort of knew them. Now, I was Jewish. We didn't do Christmas. So I wasn't as exposed to the Nutcracker as so many other younger people were who would go to the ballet around the Christmas time and see it. I mean, I saw it on television. And so I knew that. I mean, I knew the Waltz of the Flowers. We knew the bits of the Nutcracker suite. But that wasn't my first exposure to Tchaikovsky. My first exposure to Tchaikovsky came, of course, from my mother and her record collection. And it was probably the Fifth Symphony, which we had in a recording. We had a couple of them. We had Eugene Ormandy in Philly, and I also think we had Arthur Rodzinski. I think he did one too. I have to go check, but I don't remember. But we had a couple of them, and I remember the Ormandy one particularly well. And I remembered ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum-bum. That was just such a popular work with my family. And when the New Haven Symphony went and did it, we went to see, of course. We saw them do it. And it was always a question whether somebody would clap in the big pause in the finale just before the coda. You know, it goes yum bum 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 ya dum bum pause. And usually someone would start to clap. I mean, you know, it's part of the fun. And then, of course, the music starts out with da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's sort of an in-joke among classical music people if you can get through the finale of Tchaikovsky's Fifth. But that was one of the pieces. And the first piano concerto with Arthur Rubinstein, naturally. These were all things that I just heard growing up, and I loved them. And who wouldn't? Because the tunes are fantastic. The orchestration is glowing. I mean, it's just gorgeous. But the real piece that got me into Tchaikovsky was, of course, the 1812 Overture, because that's the 4th of July piece. You know, my parents would always watch, 4th of July on the National Mall, and the National Symphony always played the 1812 Overture. And best of all, one year, as a family, we went to Tanglewood on 4th of July to see the 1812 Overture done live with real cannons outside the shed. And, Tanglewood on the 4th of July is not necessarily, that's, in case you don't know, it's the Boston Symphony Orchestra's summer home. It's where they do their summer concerts. And it's a whole music center. It's glorious. It's on the old Koussevitzky estate. I think it was Koussevitzky estate, his wife's estate. And they donated it to the orchestra. And they have a whole music center and school and stuff, all kinds of things going on there. And you go up there for the day. It's in Lenox, Massachusetts. And it's just, you spend the whole day just sort of immersed in music. There are chamber groups and constant concerts and things. It's so much fun. So we were there for the 4th of July, and they were going to do the 1812 Overture. And July, even up there, is kind of sticky. It's like, ugh. The humidity is like 90%, and at night you've got mosquitoes and fireflies buzzing around. But it doesn't matter. The shed has lighting, which keeps the bugs off somewhat. And oh my God, it was exciting. It was so much fun. When those cannons went off, you feel it right in your solar plexus. It's just tremendous. And so that was, like I said, it's almost impossible to describe just how easy it was to encounter Tchaikovsky back then. His reputation has dimmed somewhat. It's dimmed as a popular figure, as somebody who, everyone just knows the tunes. I mean, people still know some of the tunes from the Nutcracker Suite, particularly because they're in television commercials and things like that. But we really knew melodies from major works. And knowing those melodies made it possible to really enjoy and encounter those major works and feel at home with them, even if you didn't hear the whole thing. I mean, for example, the first time, the Pathetique Symphony is not exactly easy listening, as I'm sure you know. I mean, the 6th is a tough piece and a sad piece. the luscious pop tune part, the second subject of the first movement, of course, is more well known and far easier to take than a lot of what's going to happen to it later on, and what happens to the symphony in general. But my first recording of the full work was, I know it was conducted by Yasha Horenstein. I'm not exactly sure what label it was originally from. It was, I think, one of those Reader's Digest things. But in those days, I know a lot of you have mentioned this. You had the same phenomenon I did. There were supermarket records where there were classical recordings that were sold in supermarkets in a series. And every month or so, another one would come out, and you would buy each thing in the series. So I would nag my mother to get me whatever was in the series. I was just a little kid. I was a weird little kid. I know I was. It's okay. I admit it freely. But I was nagging her to get, it was Tchaikovsky, so my mother, of course, said, sure, it's Tchaikovsky, what the heck. So I got this Horenstein recording of the Patatique, and that's how I learned Tchaikovsky's Patatique. I knew this is the story of a starry night, whatever that song was. But it was the Patatique Symphony, and that's how I learned it. My first recording of Tchaikovsky that I bought for myself, that I remember very distinctly, I was about, 12 or 13 or so. It was in the same batch of records that I bought in Delaware at like the Wilmington Dry Goods that had the Shostakovich Fifth with Ormandy in Philadelphia. The RCA won his second recording. It was in the early 70s. And I got Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. It was with Pierre Monteux and the Boston Symphony, a wonderful performance, by the way. And it was on RCA's super duper uber cheap label. It was, those days, I think it was called Victrola. I mean, there was RCA Red Seal Premium, then there was Gold Seal, and then there was cheap Victrola. And it, as is always the case with major labels, they had so many recordings of the same stuff, and there was no relationship between price and quality of performance. The Monteux Tchaikovsky 4 with Boston is marvelous, and it was marvelously recorded. It's a living stereo production, it's gorgeous sound, and that's how I first encountered Tchaikovsky's Fourth. My second recording was the Mravinsky, which I got from the International Preview Society some years later. They had that DG set of Tchaikovsky 4, 5, and 6, and the performances couldn't have been more different. So it was wonderful to have the opportunity to do that. But there was no composer who was easier to assimilate when I was getting into classical music than Tchaikovsky was. And I think it's a shame that he doesn't enjoy the same reputation now, because he is such a fabulous entree into the world of classical music, because he's shamelessly emotional and fabulously tuneful, but there's no pandering, there's no dumbing down. It's all music of extraordinary emotional sincerity and great passion and humanity and approachability, and you can listen to music in large forms by him without getting bored, without feeling lost, without feeling that somehow he's talking down to us. Because he never did that. He never did that at all. Even at his most sophisticated, there was always, he never lost the popular touch. That's a tremendous gift. It's a gift that tends not to be particularly respected in the classical music world because you can't quantify it. It's either there or it isn't. Some composers have it and some don't. Tchaikovsky had it in spades. So let me know how you first encountered Tchaikovsky. I'm curious if you remember, because it's a tough one, because there's just so much of it. If you're as old as I am, if you're a lot younger, maybe you had a more intriguing route into his music rather than just having it there for the taking. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.